Berlin was collapsing in on itself, a dying beast thrashing in its final moments. Buildings burned like torches, the sky glowed red with the fury of artillery fire, and the roar of bomb blasts shook the earth like thunder. The Third Reich was falling, but in the chaos of its final hours, one man slipped quietly into the darkness: SS Captain Erich Falkenrath. His name carried weight throughout Nazi intelligence divisions. He was not the kind of officer people forgot: cold, calculated. A master of coded operations and clandestine strategy, his actions shaped missions that never appeared in official archives. His decisions sealed the fate of countless lives. He was a shadow even within the shadows, the kind of man whose presence chilled a room before he spoke a single word, and then he was gone. In the final days of April 1945, as the Red Army closed in, Falkenrath was last seen near the government quarter, walking with purpose through a choking fog of smoke and ash. A junior officer spotted him moving down Wilhelmstrasse, carrying a weathered satchel and a map case. Hours later, another soldier reported seeing him enter an underground bunker access point, one not listed on any known maps. But after that, nothing. No body, no burned remains. No bullet casing nearby, no trace. Not a single entry in the death ledgers. Erich Falkenrath simply evaporated from the world. Theories flourished like weeds in the rubble. Some soldiers insisted he'd shot himself, his body lost beneath the collapsing ruins. Others swore he'd defected, taking priceless intelligence with him. A few whispered darker things, claiming he'd been preparing for months, stockpiling stolen gold, maps, and forged documents. That he had engineered his own disappearance with meticulous precision. That he had somewhere to go. But investigators found no proof, no diary, no farewell, no confession, just a void. It was as though Berlin swallowed him whole. Rumors spread through the rubble-strewn streets and smoldering ruins, but none stuck. The war ended, soldiers surrendered, and nations rebuilt. But Falkenrath remained an unanswered question, one man missing in a sea of dead, yet more haunting than any of them. The smoke had closed behind him, and the world never saw him emerge. When victory settled and the smoke cleared, Allied investigators began sifting through the wreckage of the Third Reich one file at a time. Most names were crossed off with cold finality, their fates confirmed. Executed, captured, killed in action. But one folder refused to close, one name stared back like a challenge: Erich Falkenrath. He became a ghost, locked inside government cabinets and file drawers. The OSS, MI6, CIC, every major intelligence division had a copy of his file, and none could agree on his fate. Each attempted to reconstruct his last movements, but each report contradicted the next. Witnesses were unreliable, documents half-burned or deliberately altered. The deeper investigators dug, the stranger the trail became. Pages went missing, whole sections were blacked out, photographs were mislabeled or destroyed. A single note from a British analyst summed up the entire investigation. This man was too prepared. What unnerved officials wasn't just the disappearance, it was the precision of it. It looked deliberate, orchestrated, the work of someone who anticipated the chaos of defeat and weaponized it to vanish. Post-war interrogations revealed Falkenrath had overseen operations involving coded communications, experimental weapons transport, and relocation of sensitive materials. But every lead died abruptly. Anyone who claimed to know him well either denied involvement or disappeared into the confusion of refugee relocation. No records of his family, no property documents, no personal letters. Even his birth records were partially missing. Every trace of the man had been systematically erased. Intelligence officers passed his file between departments like an unsolved riddle. A red stamp on the cover read, "High priority, unresolved." It stayed that way for decades. Over time, Falkenrath became a whisper in Cold War intelligence circles. Analysts spoke of him cautiously, like mentioning him might summon something buried. Some believed he had escaped through rat lines to South America. Others believed he died in secret Allied custody. But documents that could confirm either route were sealed under layers of classification. Files disappeared, resurfaced, then disappeared again. A name without a corpse, a trail without footprints, a question without an answer. And the longer he remained lost, the more investigators became obsessed. Because somewhere out there, they feared, Eric Falkenrath was still moving pieces on a board no one else could see. The war had ended, but the mountains never forgot. High in the Bavarian Alps, where clouds clung to jagged peaks like ghosts, villagers kept stories they didn't dare share with Allied officers. They spoke in half-sentences, in low voices, always after glancing over their shoulders as if something beneath the earth still listened. It began with the trucks. Old farmers recalled hearing engines rumbling through the night, long after fuel stores were supposedly depleted and supply lines severed. Headlights would sweep across forest paths where no road existed, then vanish behind rocky cliffs. Sometimes a convoy of 3 or 4 vehicles crawled up the mountain slopes under cover of darkness, their cargo hidden beneath tarps. No one ever saw them return. Then came the explosions. Not the artillery blasts that had echoed during the war, but sharp, deliberate detonations deep within the mountainside. The ground trembled, windows rattled, livestock panicked. Smoke would coil from fissures in the cliffs, then dissipate as quickly as it appeared. When curious villagers approached the slopes at dawn, they found fresh rockfalls blocking narrow passes that had been open the day before. But it was the soldiers that people remembered most. Shadowed figures in worn SS uniforms slipping through the trees, boots crunching on gravel at midnight. Short bursts of whispered German commands, and then disappearance. More than one shepherd swore they saw soldiers vanish into the mountains themselves, swallowed by unseen doors or cracks in the stone. One old woman, her hands trembling as she described it, said she saw a man step backward into the rock wall as though the mountain opened its mouth and closed around him. At first, these accounts were dismissed as fear-born fantasies. But when Allied intelligence heard the same stories from different villages scattered miles apart, suspicion grew. The whispers connected to one ominous concept, the Alpenfestung, the rumored Alpine fortress Hitler supposedly intended as his last stand. Many historians dismissed it as propaganda, an illusion designed to frighten the Allies. But to those who lived in the Alps, the rumors had weight. Too much movement, too much secrecy, too much noise underground. And behind every whispered account, one name persisted like a shadow: Eric Falkenrath. Villagers claimed he had been seen weeks before the war ended, directing shipments into the mountains. Some swore he had personally overseen construction deep beneath the rock. Others believed he never left at all, that he walked into the mountain and continued his work long after the Reich collapsed. The notion seemed absurd until the maps appeared. Leo Hartmann wasn't looking for ghosts. He was a cartographer, a quiet young man obsessed with lines, gradients, and the subtle language of elevation. His job was to digitize old topographic surveys from the early 20th century. Hours spent bending over maps with magnifying lenses were normal to him. Boredom wasn't. But one morning, as he scanned a 1938 Bavarian survey chart, he noticed something that felt wrong, a contour line that defied logic. At first he thought it was a printing error, a smudge from aged ink, or a crease in the parchment. But the more he zoomed in, the stranger it appeared. The line folded into itself in a deliberate, angular fashion, suggesting a hollow or artificial structure. He marked the location, shrugged, and moved on. A week later, working on a survey from 1944 covering the same region, he froze. There it was again, this time larger, more defined, as if something had expanded or been excavated. A pattern, a shape, a cavity hidden beneath the mountain. Leo dug deeper, scanning every map he could find from the region. The anomalies weren't random, they formed a grid-like pattern stretching beneath a major ridge. Straight lines where nature favored chaos, symmetry where geology produced irregularity. He cross-referenced them with elevation profiles, geologic surveys, even post-war aerial photographs. Each time the same irregularity reappeared, a rectangular void buried under hundreds of meters of granite. He found no official explanation, no mining records, no tunnels marked on any wartime engineering maps. But the strangest part was the silence files referencing that section of the Alps abruptly stopped after 1943, as if deliberately erased. Leo's intuition gnawed at him. These weren't natural caves. They weren't mining shafts. They were too structured, too calculated. And someone had gone to great lengths to hide them. He brought his findings to a senior geologist. The man skimmed the pages, frowned deeply, then pushed them back across the desk. "Don't pursue this," he warned quietly. "Some maps are wrong on purpose." But Leo couldn't let it go, because every marked anomaly matched the locations villagers whispered about, and buried beneath those ridges was a silence too intentional, too engineered to ignore. The tunnels were there. He just had to prove it. By late summer, the whispers in the villages had evolved into something darker, something that no longer died in the throat of a storyteller or faded with daylight. People who once dismissed the rumors now found themselves lying awake at night, listening for sounds that should not exist beneath solid stone. Shepherds tending livestock on high pastures swore they heard metallic echoes reverberating through the ground, sharp, rhythmic clanks that rose through the soil, like the heartbeat of something buried. At first they blamed loose rock or distant construction, but the sounds came at irregular hours, long after sunset, pulsing with a metallic certainty nothing in nature could replicate. One shepherd, a stoic man who had spent 40 years guiding goats along the ridges, confided to a priest that he heard what sounded like a hammer striking iron, methodical, deliberate, as though someone below was building or breaking something even now. Others dismissed him until more voices began reporting the same thing. Then came the hiker, a man from Munich, experienced, rational, the kind of person who scoffed at legends. He had been exploring a dense forest on the northern slope when he tripped over an exposed root and collapsed face first into the ground. As he pushed himself up, he noticed something impossible, a rectangular shape jutting from beneath the soil. He brushed away pine needles, dirt, and moss and felt cold metal under his fingers. It wasn't just metal, it was a door. A heavy steel door, bolted and sealed, its edges swallowed by tree roots grown thick over decades. The hinges were industrial, military, and embedded in the center, barely visible through corrosion, was the faint imprint of an eagle crest, wings eroded but unmistakable. Panicked, he stumbled back into town, his clothes torn, breath ragged. He tried to lead officials to the location the next morning, but when they arrived, the roots and soil had shifted. The door was gone, buried again, as if the mountain had swallowed it whole. But the most chilling account came from an elderly woman who insisted she had seen soldiers walk into the cliffs themselves. Not caves, not openings, solid cliffs. She described pale moonlight illuminating a formation of SS officers marching in single file, their boots clicking in unison. The first man reached the bare rock wall, raised his hand in a quiet signal, and stepped forward, disappearing as though the stone parted for him. The others followed, vanishing one by one. She never heard them speak, never heard them return. For decades her story was mocked until Leo Hartman's discoveries gave it new life. Local lore fed on itself, growing stronger, more detailed, more terrifying. The mountain was no longer just a mountain. It was hiding something, something built by hands that intended it never to be found. And the more the locals whispered, the more outsiders began to listen. The obsession had begun. The storm that ripped across the Alps that autumn was unlike anything the villagers had seen in decades. Black thunderheads rolled over the peaks, lightning split the sky in jagged streaks, and rain hammered the earth with relentless fury. Rivers swelled, trees snapped, and slopes crumbled. By dawn, sections of the mountain had collapsed in curtains of rock and mud, leaving scars across the landscape. And in one of those scars, exposed like a broken bone, was a structure no villager had ever known existed. The discovery was made by a woodcutter searching for fallen branches. He saw it from a distance first, a strange gray rectangle jutting from the cliffside where only granite should have been. As he moved closer, his breath caught. It wasn't stone, it was poured concrete, cracked along the edges but unmistakably man-made. A bunker wall, half buried, half collapsed, but engineered with precise angles. He scrambled closer, hands trembling as he brushed aside wet soil and shattered rock. Beneath the mud, a doorway emerged, reinforced steel frame, rusted hinges, and a half-collapsed entrance leading into blackness. A fragment of a heavy blast door lay shattered on the ground, its weight so immense it would have required machinery to move. Carved along its surface were markings, numerical codes, faint, eroded by time. He ran back to the village, shouting breathlessly that the mountain had cracked open and revealed secrets locked since the war. Within hours, a crowd gathered at the site. Some stood silent, afraid to approach. Others whispered prayers. No one wanted to be the first to step inside. The concrete bore signs of deliberate wartime construction. Rebar exposed in jagged lines, ventilation ports rusted shut, and a narrow vertical slit resembling a firing embrasure. Whatever this entrance was, it had been designed to survive and to remain hidden. Word reached local authorities, and then, faster than anyone expected, investigators arrived, not local police. Men in dark coats with clipped accents, carrying briefcases and instruments. They surveyed the entrance with unnerving familiarity. One of them muttered something in English. "This matches the old intelligence." Leo Hartman was summoned within days. When he arrived and saw the entrance almost exactly where his anomalies had suggested, his heart pounded with a mixture of dread and thrill. It was real. Hidden tunnels, hidden chambers, hidden history. A passage carefully sealed for decades, now torn open by nature's fury. As he stared into the darkness beyond the fractured doorframe, cold air seeped from the depths like a breath from something long dormant. The mountain had revealed its secret, and the truth waiting inside would be darker than anything the villagers had ever imagined. The investigators stood at the edge of the fractured entrance, like men staring into the throat of some ancient creature. Their flashlights cut thin beams through the stale, suffocating dark, illuminating drifting dust motes and crumbling concrete. The first step inside was hesitant, cautious not because they feared collapse, but because something about the air felt wrong. A sharp, acrid odor stung their nostrils, a chemical scent that clung to the walls, as if the place had been soaked in solvents or industrial compounds decades ago and never fully aired out. The deeper they moved, the stronger it became, mixing with earthy decay and metallic rot. Their lights swept over rusted rails embedded in the floor, narrow tracks meant for mining carts or transport trolleys. The steel had corroded to a dull orange crust, but the parallel lines remained intact, vanishing into shadow like two iron veins leading to the heart of the mountain. Nearby, a pile of debris collapsed under the investigators' touch, revealing scraps of cloth moldering in a heap. They weren't random rags, they were uniforms. Hair-thin threads and fragmented buttons clung to what remained wool eaten by time, leather belts cracked like ancient bark. A faint SS insignia, dulled and corroded, lay pinned to a splintered timber overhead, hanging crookedly like a forgotten corpse tag. The sight sent a shiver up every spine in the chamber. No one spoke. No one had to. This place wasn't a myth anymore. It was real, engineered, occupied, and abandoned in a hurry. They moved deeper. Their boots scraped against dust and shards of broken crates. Their lights revealed metal barrels, the paint stripped off by time. Documents lay scattered across the floor, ink washed away long ago, leaving only ghostly shapes of letters. Yet, for all the artifacts left behind, one detail chilled them more than anything: the absolute absence of human remains. No bones, no mummified bodies, no evidence of life or death. Whoever had worked here had vanished without a trace. There were beds, rotted frames, collapsed mattresses, but no bodies in them. There were shelves of empty supply cans, but no personal belongings. It felt staged, as though someone had swept the tunnels clean before sealing them. Falkenrath's name hung unspoken in the air. If this was his stronghold, he had erased himself from it with surgical precision. The investigators pushed forward, flashlights trembling slightly in their hands, each step revealing more of a facility that shouldn't have existed. They had found an entrance, just one, but beneath their feet, the darkness stretched far beyond anything they were prepared for. Mapping the tunnels became a task so daunting it felt like an act of madness. The team entered with ropes, compasses, digital scanners, and backup lighting, convinced they could chart the system in a single day. But hours turned into days. The deeper they went, the more the mountain unfolded around them. The tunnels didn't follow natural formations. They sliced through stone in stark geometric lines, precision-cut and unnervingly straight. They branched with mathematical intent, forming patterns that suggested planning, resources, and engineering far beyond a wartime survival hideout. Some corridors stretched a full kilometer without deviation. Others spiraled downward in steep, claustrophobic slopes, carved by men who understood geology too well. Ventilation shafts rose toward unknown exits, their metal grates corroded but intact. The investigators found remnants of air pumps rusted and dead, but undeniably sophisticated, suggesting the entire complex had been designed for long-term habitation. Rooms emerged from the darkness, carved directly into the granite. Bunk rooms lined with collapsed metal frames, command posts with shattered radio equipment, storage chambers filled with crumbling crates. One room held dozens of communication units, switchboards, transmitters, signal devices, all dead but remarkably preserved. It was as if this place had once been its own underground nerve center, capable of operating independently from the outside world. In a larger chamber, the walls bore faint traces of chalk markings, schematics, measurements, coded notes, scribbled in precise handwriting. They had faded into near oblivion, but the structure of the sketches was unmistakable. This wasn't a hiding place. It was a network, an operation, a project. Falkenrath had been no mere officer. He had been an architect of something enormous, something meticulously planned. The investigators followed one tunnel that led to a large hall carved like a bunker cathedral arch ceiling, reinforced with steel beams, collapsed in places but still intact. Pipes ran along the upper walls, connecting to machinery no one recognized. How had they built this without drawing attention? How had they excavated miles of tunnels under the noses of villagers? And why had they needed so much space? The deeper they ventured, the clearer the truth became. The Alpenfestung rumor had not been propaganda. It had been a blueprint, a contingency, a last stand designed in secret and executed with terrifying precision. And Falkenrath had been at the center of it. But he was still missing ghost-like, leaving only the labyrinth behind him. It happened when one of the investigators noticed a seam in the stone, a hairline crack running vertically along a wall that appeared smoother than the rest. At first it looked like a natural fissure, but when they tapped it, the sound echoed differently. Hollow, artificial. They pressed harder, scraped the surface, and revealed metal beneath the dust. A concealed panel. A hidden door. A mechanism, rusted but recognizable, sat embedded into the stone like a lock deliberately disguised. It took hours of careful chiseling and prying, but when the door finally gave way, it groaned open with a sound like the mountain exhaling for the first time in decades. Cold, stale air spilled out thick, heavy, untouched by sunlight since the war. Their flashlights sliced through the darkness to reveal a chamber unlike anything they had seen in the compound so far. This was no barracks, no storage cave. This was a workshop. The walls were lined with machinery, industrial lathes, rusted saws, mechanical presses, and strange devices with configurations none of the investigators recognized. Tables were littered with brittle schematics, rolls of yellowed paper, and fragments of metal components. A chalkboard still bore equations ghosted in white powder. Blueprints lay curled on a steel workbench, edges brown from age, their ink surprisingly intact. When they unrolled them, the breath fled from the room. They weren't tools, they were weapons. Experimental designs, prototypes for advanced technology that shouldn't have existed in 1945. Some resembled portable propulsion units. Others depicted aerodynamic shapes that looked like aircraft wings but curved in ways modern engineers would struggle to explain. And in the margins, scrawled in German, were notes detailing efficiency ratios, alternative fuels, and erweiterte Waffenentwicklung, advanced weapons development. Falkenrath's handwriting, precise and meticulous, appeared on multiple documents, each signed with an insignia the investigators had only seen in classified references. This chamber wasn't just storage. It was a manufacturing lab, a research center, a place where the SS captain had overseen experiments untouched by official records. Nearby they found crates sealed with wax stamps. Inside were machine parts wrapped in oilcloth components for something larger, unassembled, incomplete. One of the investigators whispered that this place looked like a hub for a clandestine engineering program, perhaps one intended to give the Reich an edge long after the war was lost. The implications settled over them like a suffocating shroud. Falkenrath hadn't merely escaped. He had built something secret, something dangerous. And if this was only one chamber, what else lay buried deeper in the mountain's veins? It was the metal box that caught their attention, small, rectangular, and strangely pristine compared to everything around it. It sat tucked behind a stack of rusted equipment, half buried in dust, its surface unmarked except for a faint emblem stamped into the lid. When they pried it open, expecting tools or ammunition, they found something far more personal. A journal bound in cracked black leather, edges frayed like burned parchment. The investigators lifted it carefully, afraid the brittle pages might disintegrate. But when they opened it, the writing stared back, ink faded but legible, written in tight, slanted script. The first entries were mundane, detailing construction progress, supply shortages, and environmental challenges. But as they turned the pages, the tone shifted. The handwriting grew sharper, more frantic. Falkenrath wrote of Phase Y, Phase 2 referenced repeatedly, though never clearly defined. He wrote of Das Berg Project, the mountain project, describing it as crucial for continuity and imperative to survival, phrases that made the investigators exchange uneasy glances. But it was the coded entries that truly chilled them. Entire paragraphs were written in cipher numbers replacing letters, symbols scattered among German words, decades-old encryption techniques that modern experts would struggle to crack. Embedded among these coded lines were fragments of unsettling clarity. Trust no one. They watch from within. And we have been betrayed. One entry, dated only days before his disappearance, spoke of a final order from High Command, a directive to activate the contingencies and prepare the escape route. Another referenced the southern tunnels, suggesting a second exit hidden somewhere deep in the mountain range. There were mentions of a network beyond Germany, routes through Austria and Italy, locations eerily matching known escape pathways used by SS officers after the war. But Falkenrath's tone grew increasingly desperate toward the final pages. His writing trembled with paranoia. "They know," one line read. "We cannot stay." Another scribbled sentence, smudged as though written in haste, declared, "I must disappear before they come for me." The investigators exchanged silent looks. This was no ordinary journal. It was a confession, a map, a warning. And if Falkenrath had planned an escape, if he had disappeared deliberately, then the tunnels they had explored were only the beginning. The mountain's secret wasn't just its construction, it was the man who had walked into its depths and never come out again. For days the investigators followed the journal's clues deeper into the maze, each passageway growing narrower, the air heavier as they descended into the mountain's core. The tunnels grew colder, quieter, as though the earth itself were holding its breath. Dust floated in slow currents, illuminated by the trembling beams of their flashlights. At the farthest point, beyond a collapsed storage corridor and down a steep, spiraling shaft, they found a section that felt different, older, rougher, less polished than the precision-cut corridors above. A faint draft brushed their faces, carrying with it the scent of untouched earth. And then, someone noticed it. A break in the uniform stone wall, a slit just wide enough for a man to slip through. They squeezed inside and emerged into a chamber unlike any they'd seen. The ceiling dipped low, supported by thick wooden beams that extended outward in rigid lines. Each beam was blackened with age, splintered by time, yet still held firm testament to the desperate craftsmanship of men who carved this place in secrecy. The floor sloped downward, leading into a narrow tunnel, the walls raw, scraped, and uneven. Reinforced timbers framed the passage like ribs, forming a skeletal pathway that vanished into darkness. It didn't match the rest of the facility's engineering. This was no military-designed corridor, it was an escape route, carved in haste, designed for speed, not longevity. As they ventured deeper, the tunnel narrowed until the beams brushed their shoulders. The air thinned, carrying the faint scent of old pine and cold granite. Their light struck something massive ahead, a wall of rubble, jagged boulders piled chaotically, sealing the passage like a burial mound, a rockfall, decades old. They examined it closely, hands brushing against cold stone. There were scuff marks on the timber supports, scratches on the floor, signs of movement. High up the rubble, near the top, they found a faint imprint, the rusted outline of a hand pressed into dust-covered rock. A final touch, a last moment. The investigators stared at it in silence, the truth settling heavily in their bones. This wasn't a dead end. It was once a doorway. The tunnel had led to a second exit, perhaps on the southern slope, just as the journal hinted, but that exit had collapsed long ago, swallowed by landslides or seismic shifts. Was this how Falkenrath fled? Had he slipped through this passage before it caved in, disappearing into the alpine wilderness under cover of night? Or had the collapse sealed him inside, his body entombed somewhere beyond the stones, still hidden in the mountain's cold embrace? No one could say for certain. But one thing was undeniable. Falkenrath had designed this chamber with purpose. He had given himself an escape route, and at some point he had either used it or died trying. Back in the dim glow of their makeshift command post, investigators spread Falkenrath's journal across a table, cross-referencing its cryptic entries with wartime records, intelligence reports, and post-war witness statements. The deeper they dug, the more the boundaries between rumor and reality blurred. One entry mentioned a contact identified only as R, another referenced a route über Südtirol, and others hinted at transit points through Kloster, monasteries, and Hafen ports. These weren't random words, they mirrored known escape nodes used by highly ranked Nazis who fled Europe after 1945. Rat lines. The infamous networks that ferried fugitives across borders, through the Alps, into Italy, and eventually to Spain or Argentina. For decades, historians argued about their true extent. Now Falkenrath's diary offered validation. Names scribbled in code matched surnames from real passenger lists obtained by Allied intelligence. Dates aligned with known departures from Italian ports. Even the journal's references to Vertrauen in den Süden, trust in the South, mirrored documented routes used by SS officers who vanished into South America. A chilling pattern emerged. Falkenrath wasn't just a participant, he had connections to the architects of these networks. Letters found in the workshop, marked with unfamiliar insignia, bore signatures linked to Nazi sympathizers in Genoa and Barcelona, figures whose post-war activities remained under investigation long after the Reich fell. As the investigators traced these threads, a disturbing possibility formed. Falkenrath's underground facility wasn't merely a defensive stronghold. It may have been a staging ground, an operations hub for funneling personnel, documents, technology, even stolen assets across Europe in the war's dying days. When they aligned the journal's timeline with historical events, the coincidences dissolved. Falkenrath disappeared the same week. Multiple high-ranking officials slipped through the Tyrolean Alps. His entries spoke of Die letzte Mission, the final mission written just days before others boarded ships bound for distant shores. It was no longer a legend, no longer speculation. Falkenrath had been part of something bigger, an orchestrated exodus designed to keep the Reich alive in fragmented shadows. As the team examined the final pages of the journal, the ink smudged by what looked like sweat or rain or panic, they understood the gravity of their discovery. Falkenrath didn't vanish because he feared capture. He vanished because he was following a plan, one he helped design, a plan with tendrils that stretched far beyond the mountain, a plan that had worked, thousands of miles from the Bavarian Alps on the wind-swept edge of Patagonia, where snow-capped peaks meet endless plains. A dusty archive room in a forgotten municipal office yielded a revelation no investigator had dared expect. The document was brittle, its edges yellowed, stored between birth records and land deeds. A death certificate, dated 1957, issued to a man named Ernesto Falk, aged approximately 55. The clerk who unearthed it was unsure why the investigators had even requested it, but when they examined the details, a chill settled over them. The height, 178 centimeters. The eye color, gray, blue. The scars, two. One across the left shoulder blade, another along the right wrist, injuries that matched exactly with Falkenrath's medical file from 1943. The handwriting on the form, though shaky, bore the same angled slant, the same distinctive curvature on the letter K seen in Falkenrath's journal entries. The signature was smudged, but recognizable. Ernesto Falk had been buried in an unmarked grave behind a small chapel. The investigators traveled to the village, a windswept cluster of wooden houses near the Andean foothills, where the locals spoke of a strange foreigner who arrived in 1949. Tall, stern, quiet, always looking over his shoulder. He paid in cash, bought supplies meticulously, and built a cabin on the edge of a dense forest, far from neighbors. When one investigator asked if he ever took photographs, a shopkeeper nodded slowly, disappearing into a back room. He returned with a faded black and white image, a man standing beside a rough-hewn log cabin, mountains rising behind him. His hair was lighter, his face older, but the sharp cheekbones, the posture, the intense stare, they were unmistakable. Eric Falkenrath, now hiding beneath a false identity. The investigators studied the photograph, noting the worn jacket, the distant gaze, the isolation. The man seemed carved from the same stone that hid his tunnels. Another villager recalled how Ernesto often disappeared for days into the mountains, carrying nothing but a satchel. When he died of a sudden illness, someone quietly arranged the burial, leaving no marker. No family claimed him, no papers existed, only silence, only questions. The final piece of evidence suggested the unthinkable. Falkenrath had escaped. He had lived freely, far from justice, in a remote corner of the world. And if he had made it to Patagonia, who else had? As the investigation deepened, a unified image emerged, grim, intricate, and far more expansive than anyone had imagined. The tunnels beneath the Bavarian Alps were not random caverns or abandoned hideouts. They were a masterpiece of covert engineering, a subterranean world crafted for continuity, secrecy, and survival. Analysts pored over blueprints, scrap notes, and surviving machinery, assembling the puzzle like archaeologists unearthing a forgotten empire. Every detail fit a chilling purpose. First, weapons storage vaults, lined with reinforced concrete, temperature-stable chambers, meant to house crates of munitions, explosive prototypes, and classified research. Rusted racks and decayed crates confirmed what had once been concealed. A stockpile meant to arm men long after the Reich above had crumbled. Second, experimental development rooms filled with machinery, incomplete devices, scribbled formulas, and twisted metal fragments. Falkenrath's team had been working on advanced technology far beyond the era's standards. The workshop had been the nucleus, the brain of innovation, driving secret research the world never saw. Third, escape routes, corridors carved like arteries, linking chambers to concealed exits, giving personnel multiple pathways to vanish if the mountain fell under attack. The escape chamber, with its collapsed southern exit, revealed the brilliance and desperation of Falkenrath's final design. He didn't just prepare to hide, he prepared to flee. Fourth, post-war safe havens, rooms built not for battle but for habitation. Living quarters, kitchens, ventilation systems, bedrooms carved into stone. Signs of extended occupancy suggested the tunnels could sustain dozens, possibly more for months, even years, if necessary. Water sources were diverted through subterranean channels. Air pumps kept oxygen flowing. Storage rooms once held preserved food supplies. Taken together, the tunnel system formed a chilling portrait, a hidden fortress built to preserve ideology, personnel, and intelligence far beyond Germany's surrender. A subterranean ark for a defeated regime. Falkenrath had created a contingency plan for survival, not just for himself, but for the network he believed would rise again from the shadows. The investigators sat in silence as the conclusions solidified. This wasn't paranoia. It wasn't conspiracy theory. It was fact. Falkenrath's mountain wasn't meant to withstand war. It was meant to outlast it. It was a self-sustaining fortress, a blueprint for a future that never materialized. And as they traced the tunnel's architecture, they realized one truth. The Reich had fallen on the surface, but beneath the earth, it had prepared to live on in secret chapters written by men like Erich Falkenrath, men who walked into the smoke and never returned. In the weeks that followed, officials made their decision. The tunnel's every corridor, chamber, and hidden artery were sealed off with reinforced barriers, locked behind steel gates, and marked as restricted for safety and historical preservation. Too unstable to explore further, too dangerous to leave open, too dark a history to risk becoming a pilgrimage site for fringe ideologues. Engineers filled collapsed sections with concrete. Entrance points were welded shut. Warning signs were posted along mountain trails. But even as the physical access disappeared beneath layers of stone and steel, the questions refused to die. Why had Falkenrath built it? Was he preparing for the Reich's rebirth in underground strongholds? Or simply ensuring his own survival? A selfish lifeboat carved from rock to carry one man away from justice? How far had the network reached? The journal hinted at sister sites scattered across the Alps, a web of tunnels and hidden caches that might still lie undiscovered beneath forgotten valleys. Were they all sealed? Or were some still intact, silently decaying beneath the feet of unsuspecting hikers? Did others escape using his design? The existence of the Patagonian death certificate suggested that Falkenrath wasn't alone. He had reached a safe haven thousands of miles away. If one man slipped through the cracks, how many others followed the same route through the shadows of Europe? Villagers still spoke of trucks vanishing into the mountains in the war's final months. What if those vehicles carried more than weapons? What if they carried people, scientists, officers, loyalists who resurfaced decades later under new names in distant corners of the world? Historians, investigators, and locals debated, speculated, argued. Some believed Falkenrath had been the mastermind behind a hidden exodus. Others believed he had ultimately died alone in Patagonia, a fugitive living with the weight of his past. But no one could deny the chilling clarity uncovered beneath the mountain. The truth of his disappearance, once a shadowy rumor, now stood exposed. Falkenrath hadn't simply vanished into the smoke of Berlin. He had walked into a carefully constructed labyrinth, an engineered world meant to erase him from the reach of enemies and from the pages of history. The mountain, scarred by storms and sealed by human hands, kept its deepest secrets buried. Perhaps there were chambers no search team had found. Perhaps somewhere beyond a collapsed tunnel lay another hidden exit, another room preserved in darkness. Time had covered Falkenrath's crimes in dust, but the discovery ensured they would never stay buried. The mountain, silent, cold, eternal, held the blueprint of his obsession, and those who stood at its sealed entrance understood the haunting truth. History can be buried, hidden, twisted, and forgotten, but never fully erased. This story was intense, but this story on the right-hand side is even more insane.